All right, well, happy Sunday, BridgePoint. Welcome to week 3 of a series that has us looking at the person, the life, and the story of a guy named Joseph. It's a fascinating and dramatic story that's filled with ups and downs. There's family drama, there's betrayal, there's deception and lies, imprisonment. And even in the midst of all of these unwanted, undesirable circumstances, it's a story of God's hand, God's presence, and God's power at work in and through Joseph and his unwanted circumstances. Friends, thanks for joining us. If you're checking us out online or with our online campus, shout out to everybody downtown, folks out in Seminole, and here in the room at Tyrone. We're gonna have some fun today. You good? Y'all awake? All right. As you can see, I am joined here by Curtis Thomas, who is our Seminole campus pastor. Y'all give it up for Curtis.
Hey.
Yeah, glad to have you here with us today as we continue this series, knowing that this part of Joseph's story has some parallels and some connection points to your personal story, which we'll get to later on. If you did not make it for the past 2 weeks of this series, if you haven't watched it online, go to our YouTube channel and check it out. Powerful messages, but also relatable, not only to the story of Joseph, getting to know his story, but also how his story and God's work in and through his story connects and relates to our everyday lives as well. But knowing that you're here and you may not have caught the past couple of weeks, let me give us a recap. Let me kind of give us a refresher of what's taken place up to this point in the story. Joseph's story is found in the book of Genesis. It's the first book of the Bible. So if you brought your Bible, feel free to pull that out. Or if you want to go to your Bible app on your phone, we're going to be in Genesis 37 through 50. That's where you can find Joseph's story. And in chapter 37 is where we are introduced to Joseph. He's a faithful and upright man in the eyes of the Lord. His great-grandfather was Abraham, who had many sons. If you're familiar with Abraham, one of his sons, Isaac, who gave birth to Jacob and then Joseph. So Jacob is Joseph's father. And let me tell you, as you've heard over the past couple of weeks, they had some wild family dynamics. Their family dynamics would compete with any and all of our family dynamics. We all have them, right? Some of you said yes, others said no, because you're next to the person that makes that family dynamic kind of awkward. But Joseph was one of 11 boys. And that's wild to me, one of 11 boys. So imagine those Costco runs, imagine the laundry, how many burgers are on the grill. That's a full football team, right? You have 3 sons, right?
I have 3, and they're all boys. And if you have all boys, you know your house is full of nudity and grunting all the time. So
right. That's the family dynamic. Thanks. That's your
ours.
Story. That's how your story connects to Joseph's today. I've got one boy, one girl, and that one boy is like a pack of wolves in our house. So and this is just scratching the surface with Joseph, one of 11 boys, and he was the favorite. And this wasn't just like brotherly banter where they're like, you're the favorite. No, he likes me more than me. Jacob, their father, let everyone know that Joseph was the fan favorite, even to the point that he gave him this elaborate coat. It was a robe, a tunic, a very colorful coat that made the brothers jealous and made the brothers absolutely hate him. They recognized that their father liked Joseph more than the rest of them. However, the thing that really added fuel to the fire were these dreams. Joseph had dreams, and he would dream and interpret those dreams as a sign from God. And the dreams were about him taking reign and rule over his entire family one day. And if the coat made the brothers hate him, these dreams made them absolutely furious. And as a result, they made a plot to kill him. But instead of killing him, they settled on luring him away and tricking him and stealing his coat and selling him off to slavery to some Egyptian slave traders that were passing by. And they took goat blood, wiped it all over the coat, and went back to their father Jacob and said he was attacked by wild animals and eaten. Now that's brotherly love at its best.
Another Tuesday afternoon.
That's right. So Joseph is sold off into slavery. He's heading off to Egypt, where he becomes a servant to a high-standing Egyptian officer named Potiphar. And Potiphar, in time, sees that God's hand is upon Joseph. He sees something in Joseph, and he puts Joseph in charge of his entire household. So Joseph is in charge of managing his resources and his wealth and his overall well-being. And everything is looking improved until Potiphar's wife comes into the picture. Seeing Joseph's rugged good looks, she propositions him and he rejects. Now, she propositions him and he rejects her, so she is mad and offended at this rejection. And offended by this rejection, she falsely accuses Joseph of actually trying to come on to her. Gets word out to Potiphar, and he sends for Joseph to be put up and thrown in prison. Handcuffs, fingerprints, mugshots, the works. So now it's that downward spiral yet again. But upon his arrival in prison, upon his arrival in San Quentin, the guard notices something about Joseph, the same thing that Potiphar noticed as well. He notices something special, and he notices that God's hand is upon him. And so this guard puts Joseph in charge of the entire prison over all the other prisoners. He's the overseer, and he's in charge. He has full reign and full authority over the rest. So let's stop there because, friends, at first glance, it appears that Joseph's life was this undeserved downward spiral. He had experienced schemes and betrayal, lies and deception. He had been imprisoned and falsely accused, and all of his consequences were circumstances that were unearned, undeserved, and unwarranted. However, we also notice throughout this kind of downward spiral that at every point, every turn in Potiphar's house, in the prison, we see God's presence and God's blessing, God's work in and around him and through him at every point. Regardless of the circumstances that he found himself in, Joseph remained faithful to God, trusting in God, looking to God. He maintained his integrity and his faithfulness to God, and he experienced God's presence and God's power along the way. None of it being a result of what Joseph did, any manipulation or any of his giftings alone, but all of it being about what God did, what God was doing, and how God was working in and through and around him in spite of the circumstances. And so here's the big question that kind of starts us off in this story, picking up where we are, but also a good question for us to begin working from today. And the big question is this: how is God using your circumstances to shape your purpose? And don't answer it out, but let this sink in for a minute. Think about your circumstances. Think about where you find yourself, the season of life that you're in. How is God using your circumstances, the situation that you find yourself in, to shape your purpose? Do you find yourself focusing on and trusting in what God might be doing or how God might be working in the circumstances that you find yourself in, even if they're undesirable, unwanted, or unwarranted? Or do you find yourself stepping back, disengaging, kind of feeling that sense of defeat and thinking, God's not at work in this? Friends, up to this point in Joseph's story, we see God working in and through all of his circumstances, and we're going to continue to see that today as we pick up the story in chapter 40.
Yeah, so we find ourselves in Genesis 40. And Joseph is in prison. And so about a decade has passed by. And to really understand what is taking place in prison, everything that Travis just said in terms of Joseph's story, the recap, bringing us to this moment, is vital to the story of him being in prison. In fact, I just want to point out 4 things going back all the way to week 1, actually. If you haven't watched it or you haven't seen it or don't know what we're talking about, go online to our YouTube, go on our website, and check out week 1 as Tyler opened this up and really shared the conflict that was taking place in Joseph's life with his family. But if you haven't seen it, don't worry, I brought a slide with me so you can catch up. But there's 4 things that are taking place here. First off, Joseph has these dreams. He's 17 years old at the time. He has these dreams, and after he has the dreams, he immediately goes to his brothers. The first time, he immediately goes to his brothers. And he says, hey, I had this dream that you were all going to bow down to me. Well, the brothers they already hate him, and it says that they begin to hate him more. They begin to hate him more, and because of this, they're eventually going to plan his being sold into slavery. So then Joseph has another dream just shortly after, and he tells his brothers and his dad at this point. And not only do his brothers hate him, but his dad scolds him. His dad rebukes him. His dad strictly disapproves of this and actually says, Joseph, what is this dream that you are having? He scolds him and says, this is a little absurd, Joseph. Are we going to bow down to you? So Joseph is interpreting these dreams on his own accord. He's going to his brothers. He's going to his dad. And he's not getting the results that he wants because these dreams are amazing. They're like, oh, the family's going to bow down to you. You're going to be this great leader. Yeah, I would go to my family and do that too. Yeah, you're all going to bow down to me. It's great. But his brothers hated him. His dad scolds him. And that eventually leads him to this moment in prison that we have that's taken place now 11 years later. 17 is when the dreams happen, now into slavery, now into prison. 10 to 11 years later, here's Joseph in prison. And this is where we pick up on the story, starting at verse 1. It says this: sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. The king of Egypt was the Pharaoh. And Pharaoh was angry with these two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. Now, let's just stop for a moment and give you a little bit of context what's happening here. You may be wondering, who's the cupbearer, who's the baker? Well, these two guys would have had full access to the Pharaoh at all times in Egypt. They would have been very close to him because their sole job was to make sure that the Pharaoh's drink and the Pharaoh's food had full integrity, that there was nothing being poisoned, nothing nefarious taking place. So literally the cupbearer, for instance, he would take the drink that Pharaoh has, and before the Pharaoh ever tasted it, the cupbearer would drink it to make sure that it wasn't poisoned. I don't know about you, but that's not a job that I want, right? This is his job, is to literally drink it to make sure it's not poisoned. And if it is poisoned, guess what? His job is over, right? How's your cupbearer doing nowadays?
I've recently gone through 3, which makes me question quite a bit. Looking for a 4th, though.
Yeah. Job's open.
Yeah,
you can
job
go ahead
open.
and turn your resume into Travis. That'd be great. So that was the cupbearer's job, and he had full access to the Pharaoh at all times. The baker was the same, but with the food. He was making sure the integrity of the food at all times was okay for the Pharaoh, that nothing nefarious was taking place. So these two guys were thrown into prison, and what we can speculate about this is that there was probably some sort of plot or ploy against the Pharaoh of him being poisoned, of some sort of something happening against the Pharaoh, that maybe someone was trying to kill off the Pharaoh. So he found these two guys were suspects, threw them in prison so he can investigate, and here they are in the same prison as Joseph. And it says that Joseph was put in charge of it. It says the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. Now, I don't think that this is a coincidence, because if you know anything about the rest of the story of Joseph, Joseph is going to God is going to use this relationship with the cupbearer specifically. He's going to use this relationship to eventually fulfill these dreams that Joseph initially had. So I don't think this is a coincidence that these two are placed into the custody of Joseph. So here we find Joseph in prison. These two guys have been probably suspects of murdering the Pharaoh, and Joseph's put in charge of them. And we go on. After they've been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. And when Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. Now, this goes back to week 2, last week, when Tyler was showing us the story of in Potiphar's house with Potiphar's wife. Joseph was a man of integrity. Again, if you haven't seen that, go back, because we get to see Joseph desired to do what was right in the eyes of God alone. He desired to do what was right in the eyes of God. And so we find him now in prison. And his only job, okay, he's still in prison. He may have some sort of responsibility of helping run the place or manage the prisoners, but let's not think too far ahead. He was still in prison. This was not a cush job. This was not something he wanted to do. He just, because of his personality, because of his character, because of his integrity, God had placed him in a place to where he was helping manage the prisoners. And what's important about this is we see Joseph's integrity play out, because his only obligation as this manager to the prisoners was to simply make sure the prisoners were doing what they were supposed to do. Make sure that their needs were being met. That was it. That was his only obligation, was to make sure that those prisoners are not dying, basically. We don't want them to die in prison. We want to murder them later. We want to make sure that they stay somewhat alive as much as possible. That was his only obligation. But here, Joseph comes along and he sees that these two guys are physically affected by something. He sees that they're dejected. And so he asked the Pharaoh's officials going on, who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" Again, his only obligation is to meet the needs of the prisoners, to make sure that the most basic level is managed. Yet he interjects himself and says, "Hey guys, you're obviously upset about something. What's going on? Why are you so sad?" this integrity that Joseph has continues to play out in this. And here's what the two say. Here's what the cupbearer and the baker tell him that was affecting them so deeply. We both had dreams, they answered, but there is no one to interpret them. We both had dreams last night, Joseph. Last night we had these dreams, and we're not talking about just regular dreams. We're talking about dreams to where there is something taking place that is affecting them wholeheartedly. It's showing them something that they should probably be afraid of, or something that is going to affect them in the long run. They had these dreams last night. And they say, Joseph, we had these dreams, and there's no one here to interpret them. Now, let's just pause for a moment. Because as I'm reading this story, and I'm Joseph, we're talking about 10 years, going back to when he was 17. The last time he encountered dreams, he ended up in prison because of it. The last time he encountered dreams, he was now in prison because of that. His brothers hated him. His dad scolded him. He was sold into slavery. Now he's in prison 10 years later because of these dreams. So if I'm Joseph, my human side is coming out, and I'm surrendering to the defeat. I'm surrendering to the fear. I'm surrendering to that idea of going, maybe I heard those dreams wrong. Maybe in that 10-year span, if I'm Joseph and I'm in slavery and I'm in prison, I'm probably going, maybe I was off a little bit. Maybe I didn't really have a dream. I had some sort of fantasy. Maybe I don't actually hear God in this. Maybe it was me who was supposed to bow down and to someone else. Maybe I didn't have a dream at all. See, if it was me personally, maybe it was you too. If you're in this situation, if I'm in this situation, I'm hearing the word dreams and I'm splitting. I'm out. I'm not doing this. If I hear these guys say, hey, we had dreams last night, I'm immediately going, good luck to you. Hope you figure it out. And I'm out. Because that's my human side coming out. That's my human side of going, I'm remembering where I came from. I'm remembering of what happened. I'm remembering that last time I had dreams, my brothers hated me, my dad scolded me, and now I'm in prison because of it. That's me. Maybe that's you. Maybe we can resonate here with what Joseph is saying, that where he may be in life. Maybe we can resonate with this situation that the cupbearer and the baker are having when we had these dreams, and all of a sudden all this fear and all this anxiety and all this just pain comes up from previous trauma. I'm going, nope, I'm done. I can't do that. In fact, I'm going to take my ball and go home if that's me. But Joseph, actually, the story completely turns. In fact, I believe that the entire story of Joseph up to this point culminates with this one phrase that he says in this next moment. I believe that the past 3 chapters, from chapter 37 to 40 now, of the 10 years of his life through slavery and prison, gets to this moment, and this becomes the defining turn in Joseph's life and the way that he responds. Because he says this, Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. Do not interpretations belong to God? Remember, friends, if it was me, I'm out. Figure it out yourself, guys. You're on your own on this one. I got to make sure that you don't die in prison. That's me. But Joseph in this moment, this guy who's been in 10 years of pain and trials, being traumatized from having dreams early on, comes to this moment where his response is, hey, can't God be the only one who interpret those? Can only God be the interpreter of those dreams? Guys, what you're looking for, isn't God the only one who can do that? Those dreams that you had, isn't God the only one who can answer them? See, 10 years has gone by. 10 years has gone by to get Joseph to this moment to where he is now in a very familiar situation. And his reaction is, can only God do that? And that's where we find ourselves in this story, this turning moment with Joseph.
Yeah, and I think that shift, even if it's subtle or very clear, I think that shift is important because there's a shift in momentum, just as you've made very clear that if it was us, but even in the past, you might be thinking, hey, that shot me in the foot in the past, so I'm going to have some doubts, reluctance. I'm not going to make myself available, but he doesn't. He continues to believe and trust that God is capable, that God is able. And he makes himself available to the folks around. But even thinking, as you started to kind of pull us into like, how do we find ourselves in this part of the story? I wonder if that's a good thing for us to really think about, and wonder if maybe some of us can relate to these pivotal moments in our lives. And so let me ask you this: has your trust in God, has your faith in God, your belief in God, your reliance on God ever been based on previous experiences or previous outcomes? Meaning, have you ever been hesitant to rely on God maybe a second time when life hands you yet another bag of lemons, right? Or when that same situation, that same circumstance repeats itself and the last time didn't turn out so well? Do you ever find yourself in round two or the second or third time around having doubt, having question, hesitancy, maybe feeling a sense of being defeated and not trusting God or not relying on God in the way that you feel that you should or that you want? You see, I think that those moments as we're hearing this story of the real life, you're saying, if it was you, well, if it were me, I'm not going back to that. But Joseph doesn't let this familiar circumstance get in the way of him making himself available to what God might be able to do, and only God might be able to do, and the way in which that God might be able to work in and through the circumstance as he makes himself available to the people around him. I think it's this faith-filled kind of response that we see, that shift, that is extremely important. And I think it's the big idea that can come from this part of the narrative, but also one that we can take with us today. And the big idea is this: relying on God is not based on our outcomes. It may be straightforward, may be simple, but let that sink in. Relying on God is not based on outcomes, meaning in spite of where we might find ourselves, what it is that we face, the circumstances and situations around us, regardless of what we experience and regardless of how well or unwell it worked out for us in the past, we are to continue looking to God, trusting in God, relying on God, not just out of some obligatory expectation, but out of a trust and awareness of God's faithfulness, God's goodness, and God's consistent and constant presence and power at work in our world and in our lives. And I think that's that faith-filled response that can be somewhat cliche or is easier said than done, but can have a significant change in our outlook on life and our perspective and the way that we go through life, regardless of circumstance and situations when we take it on.
Yeah, and this is where I think I look around the room here and I think about our campuses and online, everyone who's tuning in, and I think about all the different lives and stories that come to this moment that God is still unraveling, God's still moving in. And I actually want to share a season of my life to where God had to move radically in me. He had to, actually, if he was going to do anything in me, he had to move me first kind of moment. This moment that only God could do that in my life. And so to go back a little bit, when I didn't grow up in church, I didn't grow up in that I had grandparents who were Christians and who were influenced to me. But when I was 17 years old is when God radically changed my life. Is when he got a hold of my heart and he just said, you know what, you're not gonna be a punk kid anymore, and begin to mold and shape me. And a year later, that 1 year I thought that God had called me to ministry. And so a year later, I went into school to become a pastor. So I started school at 18 years old, and I didn't want to do the whole college thing. So I jumped straight into a youth ministry job there in West Texas, where I'm from. I jumped straight into a youth ministry job at the age of 18 and started doing youth ministry as I went to school. When I graduated school, I went and found my first big boy job in church. I was a youth pastor. I did youth ministry for about 13 years. And I tell you, over that course of 13 years, feeling like God had called me to this career path, he had called me to this thing in my life, over the course of 13 years, where I ended up was you wouldn't have liked me at all. Because I was the guy who was like, God called me to be a pastor, and I'm gonna be the best pastor. In fact, I'm not even gonna be, I just am the best pastor. I'm gonna write all the books. I'm gonna speak at all the conferences. I'm going to be the one that churches called and said, we have to have you at our church. Please come work at our church. And I'd be like, nah, I'm good. I'm going to stay where I'm at because God's called me here. I was that guy where my pride and my ego were so great and so much feeding into this identity that I have placed on what I thought was my calling early on. And for 13 years, I continued to grow in that until about year 8 or 9, I ended up at this church, and it was a big church, a big youth ministry, something that many youth pastors were like, man, this is where I want to be. And I thought, man, I was doing great. And I continued to build myself up, that I was the best youth pastor, I was the best speaker, I was going to write the books. I had a blog because that was a thing back then. I was doing all the things to really become that thing that I had in my mind of what I was going to be. And it all just kind of came crashing down to where all of a sudden, my wife and I found ourselves in this tiny little church in West Texas that was about 50 people. It was this tiny little church, which is a whole nother story about how that church actually helped redeem my wife and I's story. But in that church, the entire time that I was there for about 2 or 3 years, the entire time I was telling myself I deserved better. This is not what God had for me. I was supposed to be the big, I was supposed to be the bad, I was supposed to be the bold, I was supposed to be the one that was wanted. And I would look for other youth ministry jobs, and I kept coming up short in all of them. Until finally this moment to where that church of about 50 people said, hey, we can't pay you anymore. We need you to just volunteer your time. And I said, absolutely not. And I left. Because how dare they ask me to do that, right? So my wife and I started church shopping for the first time in our life. We ended up in a church, and we were serving. And at that time, I found a job as in IT because I could turn a computer on. I don't know why they hired me, but they did. Praise God. And so I was working behind an IT desk, and we were going to this church in West Texas, and we were serving, we were leading a group, and we were doing these things, and it was just never enough for me because I was supposed to be the guy up front. I was supposed to be the leader. I was supposed to be the one who was taking charge and everyone was looking to. And there came this moment after 13 years of ministry and God continually to pull me out to this moment where he said, you're not going to work in a church at all. We were sitting in church one Sunday and we were doing communion. And at that church, we passed the plates of communion. It had the bread in the middle and the juice on the outside, this symbol of Jesus' body broken for us, the symbol of Jesus' blood shed for us. And they came and said, we're short an usher. Do you mind helping? I'm like, absolutely. And so I went and grabbed the plate and I went and stood in my position. And guys, I can tell you to this day, this was back in 2013, I can tell you the exact thread on the carpet that I was standing on when this happened. I am standing there holding these plates of communion. I'm standing there holding this representation of Christ, his sacrifice for me. And the pastor is up on the stage and he's getting communion ready for everyone. And as I'm standing there, all of a sudden that little voice in the back of my head pops up and goes, this is where you deserve to be. My entire earth shattered. My entire earth collapsed in that moment. It was so radical for me. I went and sat back down. My wife goes, are you okay? I was like, I'll tell you later. It affected me so deeply because for the first time in 13 years, I realized why I was not in ministry anymore. And for the next 3 years of my life at that IT desk, it was the hardest spiritual battle that I've ever had. And to some, it seems a little bit silly, like, oh yeah, your pride and ego and all this stuff. No, for me, it was everything. Because the dream that I had for my life was not going to happen. The dream that I thought God had for me was all of a sudden null and void. For 3 years, I wrestled with this. I wrestled with being an IT guy. I wrestled with not being a pastor. I wrestled with having to sit in church and not lead. And for 3 years, I had to have this massive heart change. And I'll tell you, the moment that it all clicked, where my head and my heart connected for the first time in all of this, is I was sitting behind the IT desk. And I would go in about 10 or 15 minutes early every morning, and I would journal. I'm a big journaler. And I actually brought it this morning. I'm not going to read it to you because it would probably get me in a lot of trouble. But if you're a journaler, you get this. I have tons of journals going back all the way to 2009. And this is the journal that I had during that season. And I would open it up every morning before I'd start work in the IT company, and I would write. And there was this one moment in this journal right here. It's where all of a sudden the words came out, and my head and my heart connected. And I just said, God, if I'm not a pastor, I'm going to be okay. If I'm not a leader in the church, I'm going to be okay. All I wanted was to do whatever you had planned for me. If it was sitting behind an IT desk, great. If it was taking out trash, great. If it was being a business owner, great. If it was going back into ministry at some point, great. All I wanted was for God to be glorified in my life and no longer for me to be glorified in that. It took 3 years for me to get there. It took 3 years, after 13 years of pride and ego, for God to squash that. And I tell you, to this day, 10 years later, I still wake up and I don't want to go back to that moment. I don't. I'll be the first one to tell you, my greatest sin in life is pride and ego because it plays out in my life. What is the stories that we wrestle with? What are the moments to where you and I are looking for this only God can fulfill this moment? What is the place that you may be in to where you may be going, only God can do this? Maybe it's going back to a dream. Maybe it's going back to something God put in your life and saying, God, if that is it, then take me back to that. Maybe you're in the middle of the trial and the hurt. Maybe you've given into the fear and defeat that you'll never be what you think God was making you out to be. There's one more part of Joseph's story in prison that as I was reading through this, I almost didn't include it, but I thought, man, this is so powerful in Joseph's story. Because up until now, we have not caught a glimpse of the pain Joseph's going through. Up until now, in these 3 chapters, this 10 years of life that Joseph has found himself in, we've not caught a glimpse of what he is going through spiritually or emotionally. It's really just been sharing his story. But there comes this moment to where they tell the cupbearer and the baker, they say, hey, we have these dreams, and Joseph interprets them. He says, only God can do this. And through the grace of God, he gives them in the interpretation. And right after he interprets the cupbearer, which he said, what God is saying through your dream to the cupbearers, in 3 days, you're going to be restored back to Pharaoh. You're going to go back to your position. But there's this one verse to where we have a glimpse of what Joseph says, or Joseph's heart. And he says this to the cupbearer, but when all goes well with you, remember me, show me kindness, mention me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this prison. Do you feel it yet? Do you feel what Joseph is in that moment? Is he may have come to this, hey, only God can do this moment. He may have, his heart and his head may have connected and said, you know what? The dreams that I thought were there, only God can do anything with those. But he still comes to this moment where he's like, I just don't want to be in prison. I don't want to be here anymore. Whatever it is God has for me, please get me out of this place. And what's fascinating about that is Joseph never asked for his dreams to be fulfilled. And he never asked for what's about to happen in his life because he's going to become number 2 in command in Egypt. He never asked for that. He just simply said, God, only you can do it. So please get me out of this prison. Man, this morning, what is the story that you're living in? What is the story? I'm still living in that story. I'm still waking up every day and going, God, I don't want the pride. I don't want the ego. I just want you. And if for whatever reason God takes me out of ministry this afternoon, man, I'm going to be okay. I'm going to be okay. What are the only God moments that you need to hold on to? What are the only God moments that you need to go back to? If you're a young person and you're in this moment of dreaming about what's ahead of you, amazing. Dream big dreams. But remember, only God can fulfill those. And what are the moments? What are the only God moments that we have to hold on to this morning? Would you pray with me? Father, I can't imagine the stories that are in this room, the stories that are in our campuses, anyone watching. I can't imagine the stories that are being unraveled in this place, in this space. God, moments that only you can accomplish, dreams and things that only you can do and fulfill. Father, I pray that you would just make us a people who rely completely on you, no matter what the outcome brings, no matter what the future is, no matter where we go from here, no matter what takes place in the next moments or seasons of our life, that we fully rely on you and you alone. God, personally, remind me of my story always, that I'd never get back to that moment that you stripped me of. The stories of people in this room and people watching and listening that maybe have come to that same realization that only you can do this. Father, remind us of those and keep before us that you are with us and you are fully in control. And may we be people who just rely on you wholeheartedly. Father, do with us what you need to do. Move mightily in our hearts and bring us closer to you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.